So welcome everybody and good afternoon to our Chicago Research Summit session here. This session is titled Photography and Housing Reform in Chicago from 1895 to the present. And I'm really excited to introduce Robin Hoecker from DePaul University, who will be presenting for us today. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Robin.
Thanks. I made a list of all of the archives that I'm going to mention in here, but Zoom is not letting me, it's not letting me paste in the chat for some reason. So I have this list. I'm happy to share it. Just email me if you want any of the links to this archive. So I'll go back ahead to screen share. I tried. Okay, so everybody, thanks for joining me and making it to the last panel of the day. I appreciate you guys staying with me. There have been so many great panels. So I'm going to talk about photography and housing reform in Chicago. I teach photojournalism at DePaul, and I'm always trying to bring in local archives into my work and into my teaching. And so this is basically work that I've compiled that tells an interesting narrative about public housing in Chicago. So if you Google public housing in Chicago, these are some of the images that are the first to show up in a Google search. They're usually pictures of high rises that are connected to stories that are about crime and failure in public policy. And so when people think of public housing who don't have lived experiences in those places, these are some of the images that come to mind. And they were some of the images that were in my mind when I was looking through archives for a research project that I was working on, when I came across these images, which are photos of the Ida B. Wells housing project in Chicago from 1942. And I just became very fascinated with these pictures and wanted to know more about them and more about the history of public housing in Chicago, which led me to this book by Bradford Hunt called The Blueprint for Disaster, which really chronicles the rise and fall of public housing in Chicago, which helped me kind of put these pictures that I was looking at into a broader perspective. And what I realized is that the pictures, which are kind of in this middle area right here, are just a slice in time of public housing in Chicago, but also a narrative about photography and the way that photography can be used to document the need for public housing and the stories of the people who live there. And so this is, I've kind of looked at different eras, and I'm going to talk in each era about the historical context, what was going on, what was happening in terms of housing and specifically public housing, what was going on in terms of photography at the time, and then some examples of archives that kind of show that era of photos. So the first is the reform era. This is the late 1800s when we're talking about industrialization, urbanization. People are moving into cities and we're importing a lot of labor from Southern and Eastern Europe, and there's a lot of labor strife. And so these are all pictures that are from local archives. So these are pictures from a Hull House publication that I'm going to talk more about soon, but you can kind of see the overcrowding of people's living situations and the fact that people were living and working in their homes at the same time. Tenements are where people were living, which were completely unregulated. So they were very overcrowded and unsanitary. There was no air circulation, there was no trash, there were no sewers, which led to the spreading of disease. And there were also lots of unsupervised children, which led to crime and other kind of social issues. The photography at the time is always exemplified by Jacob Riis, who did How the Other Half Lives in 1890. I'm sure you've seen pictures like this in your history books. Which is the background to this book, The Tenement Conditions in Chicago from 1901. So this is attributed to Robert Hunter and the City Homes Association, but it was really Jane Addams' project. Robert Hunter lived in Hull House, and she actually referred to herself as the chairman of the investigating committee for this report in her own documents. And in the press, it's generally attributed to Addams. And so even though now that we're looking at it later, we don't attribute it to Jane Addams, it really is part of her work. And so these are all pictures from that book. They're all on archive.org. The entire report is, and all the photos that are in there. So again, these are kind of Riis-like images of the insides of housing. You can see the poor conditions of the streets and poor conditions of sidewalks. There are a lot of pictures about structures and infrastructure, talking about the need for alleys and sewers and the way houses are so tightly packed together that it creates unsanitary conditions. An interesting thing that they did that Reese didn't do is that they showed visual solutions. So they showed what could happen if you did have sidewalks, what would happen if we did plant trees, what would it look like if we had playgrounds for our kids to play on instead of having them play in the trash-filled alleys, which offers a visual alternative to what you were seeing with Jacob Reese's work. It was published in nationwide. Really were comparing to Reese and saying that it was actually even more effective. And it led to things like housing ordinances being passed in Chicago and the creation of the city's first homeless shelter. So the next era is the Depression era. Obviously, the Great Depression was a huge issue in the United States with lots of unemployment and poverty and migrant labor. And so the archive I'm going to talk about here is the Farm Security Administration archive, which is available through the Library of Congress. So the context of this within Chicago is the overcrowding of housing in Black areas because of the Great Migration. People are moving to the city in great numbers, and then they have nowhere to go when they get here because of restrictive covenants and things like contract lending. And so they kept dividing the apartments into smaller and smaller units, which were called kitchenettes. And so here's an example of a photo from a kitchen apartment where everybody's kind of living in a one room or one or two room apartment. The context of this in terms of photography is this is the documentary era of photography with the Farm Administration. This was a government program that documented the lives of the poor and was basically meant to drum up public support for the New Deal policies. I've always learned about FSA in terms of its documentation of kind of rural people, especially in the South. But Chicago's actually well documented within the FSA, and there's a couple different archives that mention that. This first is this book, Chicago and Downstate, which was published by the Chicago Historical Society. And you can also look at the Library of Congress FSA archive and just put Chicago into the search term and you'll get about 2,000 images. And then the next one is this book, 12 Million Black Voices, which is published by Richard Wright and Edwin Roscam, who was an FSA photographer. And that is also available on archive.org. And so this was a follow-up, kind of a visual follow-up to Richard Wright's Native Son, which was a huge bestseller at the time. And so they were trying to kind of piggyback on that and highlight the work of the FSA photographers. And so here are some of the photo spreads from these books that are documenting Chicago within that project. And you can see that these pictures are really foregrounding the worst conditions. These are, kind of depravity images that are there. And they even talk about it in the book saying, we're not showing you the talented 10th, we're really showing you the worst possible conditions because these are the things that we want to have addressed. But some people criticize them for doing that, saying that they were being too sensational. And here's that kitchenette apartment. Interesting for those of you who are interested in photography and editing, this girl's sticking out her tongue in the original, the girl in the center of that picture, and they actually used ink to edit it back in. So before they even had Photoshop, they were already altering images. But you can kind of see that there's a distance between the photographer and the subject. So this is a white photographer photographing in this neighborhood in Bronzeville. There's looking down on the subjects as well. And so there's somewhat of a friction, I think, between the photographers and the subject here. And they're very, very different from these images, which is where I started this presentation, which are the World War II era images. And this image and this image are taken in the same neighborhood, less than a year apart. And I think they illustrate the general shift in the type of images that the FSA was producing before Pearl Harbor and then after Pearl Harbor. So before Pearl Harbor, we were focusing on poverty and how we're going to fix these problems. And then after Pearl Harbor, it was all about how can we show a united front to promote the war effort. We're not going to highlight our problems. We're going to kind of sweep them under the rug and focus on what's going right in our country. So this is the Ida B. Wells homes. This is the first time that we had public housing in general and the first public housing unit that was built in a Black area. At this time, public housing was completely segregated. But it was part of this larger government initiative to provide housing, provide public housing for people, especially workers who were affiliated with the war. The FSA moved to the Office of War Information. So this is, again, that shift to wartime propaganda from being one of documenting poverty to one that's like all about the war effort. The FSA actually moved from the Farm Security Administration to the Office of War Information at the time when these pictures were being made, which I think tells you a lot about their greater meaning. And there's a lot of letters between the photographers and their editors, and they're being told to make the country look good. You know, apple pie, harvest, bountiful harvest, pour maple syrup on top kind of stuff. And they're being told to not focus so much on the problems, especially race problems, because it gives the enemy, it gives Hitler a chance to use that against us in terms of propaganda. And they were also very concerned about African Americans and whether or not they would support the war, because this was part of the double V campaign in the Black press, where people were saying they needed to have victory at home and victory abroad. So the government was trying to show that they took care of its Black citizens, and that the Black citizens should in turn also support the government in the war. So that's the context of these pictures, which I think is really interesting. And so notice the cars out front and just the decor of these pictures in terms of the types of furniture, the types of clothes that people are wearing, that they're trying to show that this is a middle-class family and that they are doing well. The use of technology in the background, the phone, the radio, the newspaper, again, showing that that they're educated, that they have technology in their home, they're a middle-class family. They also show a lot of pictures of healthcare and healthcare workers, not only showing that they can get medical care, but they are also providing training and professionalization for Black professionals to get jobs. There's a lot of these patriotic type of pictures with flags in the pictures that are kind of getting at democratic engagement and community engagement. And then this idea of progress. So, you know, different generations and showing the picture of life on the farm before, perhaps in the South, versus life in the North, suggesting that there's a march of progress, racial progress happening here. And then finally, again, this is 1942, just a couple months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There's a lot of these kind of scouting images that show boys in uniform and taking apart airplanes, kind of showing them as future soldiers, I would say. And these pictures were distributed in a pamphlet called Negroes at War. And again, all of these things are online. That was distributed widely throughout Black communities across the country. And they use a lot of those FSA images in them. So here's some pages from that where you can see they actually cropped out on the left. One of the earlier FSA pictures, the window's broken in the bottom and they just cropped that out. But again, they're just kind of narrating this story of progress. These are Jack Delano's pictures of the Chicago Defender being distributed. There you can see her, I think her tongue is out, can't tell. In different versions, her tongue is sticking out, and other ones they've edited it back in. And this is the overview of the I.W. Wells housing complex, again, suggesting that the government is taking care of its citizens. And so it needs asking its citizens to give to the war effort. The next era is what I call urban decay era of the 80s and 90s. And this is when we're seeing cuts to public welfare, loss of manufacturing jobs, spikes in violent crime, drugs and gangs, discussion of super predators, the war on drugs, and the kind of shift into mass incarceration, which is, we're reviewing now and dealing with. In terms of public housing, we had moved into a kind of a cost-cutting model of building large-scale public housing that didn't have many elevators, didn't have maintenance for elevators. They made it so only the poorest of the poor could qualify, which meant a lot of single mothers with multiple children, which changed the dynamic of who was in the building in terms of adult supervision. That kind of created bad situations. In terms of photography, this is when newspapers were really at their peak. This is before Craigslist, before the internet. So newspapers were still kind of flush with cash. They had large photojournalism staffs, and they covered a lot of crime news, and often in a very sensational way. So you would see stories like this about this young child who was pushed off one of the the Ida B. Wells homes, that received a lot of attention. And you would always kind of see stories like this about these terrible things that happen in public housing. And it's also a time that you have to remember that there was a lack of diversity in newsrooms in general, but also among photojournalism staff. So the book that highlights that for me is called The American Millstone, which is a series of articles that were published in the Chicago Tribune that they then later published as a book. And again, the whole thing is available on archive.org. And so here are some of the pictures that are in that book, but you can kind of see that they're focusing on the problems, and especially focusing on youth. There were some counter narratives to that, and so I think it's important to include those in here as well. One is the work of John White, who was a photographer at the Sun-Times, who explicitly said that he was trying to show more pictures of everyday life and not just the worst problems that existed in those communities. Another one is the documentary called Public Housing by Frederick Wiseman. It's also in the Ida B. Wells homes, where again, he's trying to highlight the stories of average people who live there and the conditions in which they're living, and not trying to sensationalize it. Which brings me to the era that I think we're in now, what I'm calling the revisioning era of public housing. That's kind of in the 2000s to where we are now, where we're kind of reckoning with the past and trying to make amends and address the racial justice in all areas, in terms of storytelling, in terms of crime, housing, everything, and government. In terms of housing, the housing context, this is when we see the public housing is being torn down. So the demolition of all of those large public housing units. There's shifting to vouchers and mixed use developments, and actually people are being just dispersed to other areas. But we're also trying to recover the stories and culture of people who lived there. And so there's a couple projects that I think are relevant to that. The first is, so in general, like in photography, we're still kind of shifting to social media and the idea that people can tell their own stories, which is the concept of participatory photography. We're trying to make an effort to get more diverse voices, and instead of speaking for people who can't speak for themselves, instead of that mantra, we're actually listening to people and giving them a microphone or a camera in this case. So a couple projects that are related to that is this film called 70 Acres in Chicago, which I think is available at least through DePaul's library, which was made by a local filmmaker over 20 years about the lives of people who've lived in Cabrini. This project, Demolished, about the end of public housing, by Patricia Evans, who documented the lives of people in public housing over many decades. And then the last one is this collaboration between the Chicago Housing Authority and DePaul's DePaul's College of Digital Media, which is training people who live in public housing to tell their own stories and kind of giving them the tools to tell the stories themselves. And I think that's kind of where we are now. And so part of what I'm trying to show is that we don't get there to where we are now without having this entire history of public housing, the creation of public housing, how it was envisioned in the beginning versus how it kind of ended up being, but also the story of photography in terms of how are we able to tell those stories, and the kind of the culture of photography in terms of what kind of stories are told. And so we often look at these as separate things, like we take these pictures out of context without thinking that these are part of a war propaganda time. And I think it's really important to maintain that historical context when you're looking at these pictures. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That is really interesting. And I hadn't seen some of the what you called counter narrative images. I'm curious, and please put your questions in the chat if people have questions, but I'm curious, how do your students respond as you kind of share this material with them? What kind of reactions or interactions have you had with the students?
I mean, a lot of them, it depends. So some of them are from Chicago and are from some of these neighborhoods. So they're familiar with the more realistic version of public housing. But I also have students who are not from Chicago or who grew up in the suburbs. And for them, they don't know this history at all. Like they know that first slide that I showed you of the Google images of the high-rise towers, and that's all they know. And so for them, I think it's really eye-opening. And I think it kind of illustrates divisions within the classroom based on what their own experiences are, lived experiences within Chicago. But it makes for interesting discussions too within the classroom.
So we are at that place that I feared, where my Zoom chat is frozen and I can't read it. So if there are questions there, maybe you can see if there are.
I'm sorry, I can't paste all the links. I'll give them to you, Matt, and you can distribute them after.
Yeah, please do. And that was something we talked a little bit about at the lunch for those of us who were there, is trying to distribute some of the material that was shared today. There's been a lot in a lot of different sessions, and somehow trying to organize that and make that available. And I don't have the answer of how we'll do that, but that is something we're going to work on. So
yeah, and I will say that part of this was in the context of the pandemic. So I used archive. A lot of the books that I mentioned are on archive.org, which I love using. I use it for so many things because you can get the first editions of these books, you know, and they can click through them digitally, and they're publicly available and they're free. And so I was using a lot of materials on archive.org just to try and get students not just reading articles, but looking at visual things in a different way. That I found really helpful, and I'm going to use going forward.
So as a librarian, one of the things we teach is information literacy, and I'm just really thinking about, it's just so easy to Google images, right? For whatever you're working on, or you're putting together slides and you're like, let's just Google images. But I think your presentation really suggests we really need to think about who took those images, what was the purpose? I don't know. So what kind of advice maybe do you give your students, or would you suggest as we think about how to teach people how to interrogate images that they may come across?
I do an exercise in one of my classes kind of about diversity and culture. We Google like business magazine cover and then health magazine cover and see what kind of images come up. And you always see, you know, white men for the business magazine covers, and like young white skinny women for the, you know, and those kinds of things, I think help you realize that the algorithm is not neutral.
Yeah.
You know, like we're seeing images and you're getting results in a search engine based on popularity, what it thinks you want, what it knows about your background. And I think that's really eye-opening for students to realize. And then we also have them Google things where they get different results, you know, depending on their own characteristics. And I think that's really eye-opening, because you think the search engine, it's neutral, and not realizing, oh, it's giving me what it thinks I want to see.
Yeah, it feels so objective, right? It feels so,
and it
like,
has all
these
these
are the
bios
pictures.
built in. Like when you Google public housing in Chicago, you're only getting those high-rise, you know, burned out building kind of images. And what does that say? And why do we only see those images? I think those are important questions to ask. Yeah,
like those images, I think it was from the Sun-Times reporter. I don't know, they're just so interesting to like have those in contrast with some of the more traditional images. So yeah, I think we're gonna break protocol here. If anybody has a question, you want to jump on, unmute yourself, and yeah, love to hear your thoughts. Also, I know it's Friday and it's almost 3 o'clock, and it gets to be a little hard to continue. Well, I just want to thank you again, Robin. Thank you for sharing this material. It's a lot to think about, and I think it's so interesting to think about pictures and images and how we process them and how they get used in different contexts for different purposes. And yeah, it's something I think is just as a society we need to continue to give a lot of thought to, and be more savvy in how we use images and interpret them. So thank you for your presentation, and thank you to everybody who has stuck it out to 3 o'clock for the Chicago Research Summit. I was really pleased with today. I hope you found something that was helpful or inspiring, or something that you can think about, maybe incorporate into one of your courses or into the work you do. And we really appreciate you being with us. There is on the homepage for the Chicago Research Summit at chicagoresearchsummit.org opportunity to sign up for a listserv, an email list, and we will be sending information, follow-up information through that. So if you're interested in knowing when these videos are posted or other updates, that would be a great way to stay in touch with us. And I hope you all have a good weekend, and I think that will conclude it.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming. And my email's in my name down there. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll stay on too if anybody has any things you want to share. Someone said Department of Urban Renewal link. Okay, what is that? Who's Crystal? Crystal, what is that? Oh, you're talking for me. Oh, I thought you were talking about something else.
Oh, someone in the chat, Michelle McCoy, had posted the link to the Chicago Public Library collection. So
Okay.
I just want to say thanks to everybody. These are really great connections to terrific photos that show the complexity of different sides of the story, different ways to tell the story, depending on the person who's behind the lens. And the change over time was really helpful, and the context discussion. So thanks for that.
Thank you. I always enjoy this conference. I look forward to it being in person again next year.
Yeah, I do as well. Glad we were able to do it this way, but it would be fun to be back together.
All right.
So,
Thank
all
you.
right. Well, thank you, Robin. I think I'm gonna have to shut down my computer. That tends to be how I have to end these things. So,
Always something.
so yeah, I don't know what's going on.
The links that I have. I don't know why I can't post it in the chat.
Yeah, if you could just email those to me, we'll make sure we somehow make those available or put them in an email that we send out to people. So what is your actual department? What?
I'm in journalism.
Journalism? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a history professor here at North Park who teaches a World War II class, and I've been thinking it'd be really interesting to just do World War II in Chicago, and some of what you were showing of how it impacted the African American, or how, kind of how it got portrayed, and some of those tensions. I would love to know more about that.
Yeah, there's a really good curious city about the Japanese who moved, the Japanese people who moved to Chicago. Like 30,000 Japanese people moved to Chicago after they left the internment camps. Which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and they were saying in the activism class session I was in today that there were a couple of buildings that the federal government purchased in Chicago to use for interning Chicago Japanese Americans. I haven't really heard very much about that, and I don't know. Yeah,
where did you hear that?
So in the DePaul on the activism panel discussion that happened at 1 o'clock.
Okay.
It was from 1 to 2. It was Ewan Haig, I think, was the kind of led it, and Michael James and Katie, I forget Katie's last name, but they do a class focused largely on the 60s and 70s kind of protests and between the African American, Black Panther movement and women's rights activism in that era. But then they were talking about, at the end, there was a real interesting conversation about all the different stories of social action in Chicago and how those are kind of maybe at risk of being lost, or they're scattered. They said there was for the Japanese one, they mentioned a Japanese American museum in Chicago that has some information on that. Ewan said he hadn't actually tracked down which buildings they were, but apparently there was some buildings. And we talked about Native American activism in Chicago, and how there was conversation that the media focuses on a few, like the Democratic Convention of '68 gets a lot of press. Yeah. There were other movements that impacted our city that kind of get lost.
Yeah, sounds like I should go back and listen to that panel.
So yeah, hopefully the recording got cut out a little bit in the middle, but I think I got the meat of it. So so you can be looking for that one, or check out, connect with Ewan at DePaul maybe, and he could point you in those directions.
One of those names I see all the time, but I've actually never met him in person.
Takes these events sometimes to meet the colleagues at our own schools. I've had that experience.
Yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of DePaul people here.
Yeah, I really appreciate the support from DePaul. All right, well, have a good weekend, and we'll be in touch.
All right.
Bye for now.